shockingly a disrespectful response to our report. And I know the minister's apologized, so I'm not going to rub that in, but I think what it did was, and then the immediate controversy over this mydemocracy.ca poll and survey, whatever one thinks of it, has distracted people from actually reading the report and saying, oh, a parliamentary committee has now recommended proportional representation, and a parliamentary committee has specifically said ranked ballots or preferential ballots are the only system worse than first past the post. I worry that the substance of our majority recommendations, some of them were unanimous, of course, aren't really being noticed or absorbed in the media or in general in the public. And sorry if I've gone on a bit long, and I turn it over to Nathan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I don't have a great deal to add. I think that was a very good summary of how we got to where we are right now. And I would encourage people not to, as Elizabeth ended with, not to fall into the skepticism that has become the narrative to this point, that despite the minister's performance or particular comments that she's made, the promise made by the now Prime Minister, and repeated many times since, that 2015 was the last election under first past the post, and that we were going to make every vote count. The committee did its job. As I think we made some history, first of all, in just the way the committee was constructed, allowed every party to be there and be represented, and it was also, the committee, as you know, or maybe know, is based on basically the votes that Canadians cast in the last election. So the fact that it worked is a nice beta test, if you will, of what a future House of Commons could do, which is that parties have to find compromise amongst each other. We have to try to work together. Of course, the disappointing thing has been the challenge in bringing the Liberals over to just to even acknowledge the evidence that we heard. Almost 90% of the Canadians who came to the open mics asked for a proportional system. Virtually that same percentage of experts that we talked to from within Canada and around the world said if you're going to change and you want to make every vote count, proportionality is your question. And now, once you pass that gate, the questions become, well, what kind of system? Yet we seem to be stalled back on that point with the current government, that they don't seem to want to admit that that's the overwhelming consensus out there. And it somehow reminds me a bit of the early, or maybe for some, the ongoing climate change debate, that if you can find a few professors who say that there's elements of proportionality that aren't perfect, then the government can claim, well, there's no consensus, there's still a debate, we shouldn't move ahead. That's wrong. That breaks their promise, and that's something. So in terms of what's next, I think that goes back to the people, many of you on this call, and I should say thank you to all the people that came to our events and filled out the survey, to put pressure on those individual members going ahead from the House of Commons to say, hold your promise. We expect no more, no less. And that'll be the next stage before we get to the actual legislation, which we believe is due sometime in the spring, probably in May. But unless there's public interest, public attention to that, then the cynics in the media and around the political operatives will tell the Prime Minister, don't worry, you can break this promise without any political consequence. And that, I think, would be a shame, simply because this is about our democracy, but it's also about the Prime Minister's word and what integrity that word has for Canadians when he makes a promise. And I still think the path is available. It becomes difficult, but it requires interest from people like you and the ability to go, as Lead Now did last week, and directly reach out to individual Liberal MPs and remind them of what they said and what they ran on and what they were elected on. But I'll end it there, Alandra.
Thanks. I know you've both alluded to it, but can you give us sort of a little more on what was in the report? There was a lot of commentary about the process of how you produced the report and the fact that there were a number of reports attached. It was confusing for the public, I think, and because the survey was launched immediately after, there hasn't really been a really profound delving into what is the significance of the recommendations actually is. So give us from each of your perspectives, what was in that report?
Which one first?
Why don't you go ahead, Elizabeth?
Okay. Well, to say, the report, number one, we're not the first parliamentary committee to study electoral reform. The first was in 1921. So when Nathan says it was historic, I want to underline that. In 1921, the parliamentary committee found that first past the post, the system we use now, is completely unsuited for any democratic system where there are more than two parties. And since 1921, Canada has had 3, 4, 5, even 6 parties represented in the House of Commons. And a lot of people forget this is consistently now since about the 1920s. So having had 1921 be the point where Parliament said this system doesn't work with a political culture like Canada's, nobody at the federal parliamentary level has ever said, so what do we replace it with? But we did. We said proportional representation, a system of proportionality, which achieves a very high degree of proportionality. Now, high degree of proportionality is conveyed in terms of a term called the Gallagher Index, which was then both, and I think this was the low point in the Liberals' so-called supplemental report, but was really a dissent, that said that we had actually recommended a voting system that required using the Gallagher Index. That's not the case. No voter is going to have to know how to do a complex mathematical formula any more than someone by the side of the road who's asked to blow a breathalyzer has to understand the chemistry of blood alcohol limits before you hit a 0.5. You don't have to know anything about chemistry to agree that breathalyzers by the side of the road are a good public policy tool. That's the Gallagher Index. It's a public policy tool to say, okay, this degree of proportionality, 5 or less, is highly proportional. Now, that leaves what's on offer within that. Well, single transferable vote, such as they use in Ireland, or mixed member proportional, such as in Germany or New Zealand, or some mixture of the two, like the One Fair Vote Canada had been proposing, which is loosely based on Jean-Pierre Kingsley's idea of rural-urban proportionality. That's what we recommended. What we specifically didn't recommend was it would have been a proportional system that met the Gallagher 5, would be pure proportionality, where voters just go in and say, this is my party of choice. And then you wouldn't have a connection to a local MP. So we specifically said that's not appropriate for Canada. And we also, in the text of the report, which as far as I recall was unanimous, was that what we had heard about preferential ballot, ranked ballots, which is also part of our mandate to study as a committee, that really wasn't even on the table, that it failed at so many levels, primarily because it doesn't make sure every vote counts. In terms of proportionality and reflecting the way people have actually voted, ranked ballots, we heard from a number of experts, was the only system worse than first past the post. So we did provide clear advice, and supplemental reports, there were 2. There weren't a lot of additional reports, but Nathan and I, so Green and NDP.
So I'm just going to stop you there for a sec. Yeah. So maybe I will bring Nathan in on this question. Any other comments around the report that was unanimous, and also a little bit more about the Green NDP minority report? If you could comment about what was in there that's as of significance to us today.
Sure. So the broad strokes are that it's an unusual moment in that you had in the broad report, all of the opposition parties, the Conservatives, the Greens, the Bloc, the NDP, working very hard to help the government keep the government's promise, which was to end first past the post by the next election. Now, of course, for the Bloc and the Conservatives, the hard line, if you will, was around the questions of referendum and having one prior to any change, which is a defensible position. It's not an ideal position because, as we know, referenda cost a lot of money. They have some very significant negatives one has to pay attention to in a country like Canada. But we were open to the government and saying, what about if we brought in a new voting system and then subsequently an election or 2 down the road, we asked Canadians in a confirmation referendum that didn't cost as much money, whether to keep the new system or go back. The Liberals generally, in what they wrote and what they said to Canadians, was hit the brakes, that nothing could be done prior to the next election, that we'd have to set up another committee, another study group, another process in which to go out and hear again from Canadians about this issue, and that they were telling the Liberal government to break the Liberal government's promise. That was if you get the Coles Notes version, was to say don't fulfill your promise of making 2019 the next election that we fight. So what we're trying to do is address any of the barriers that the government has in terms of not upsetting their caucus, in terms of making something happen in a progressive way that also keeps their word, which I think, I'm kind of simple. I think when you run and you have a platform and you win, that's a mandate, and you should try your very best to fulfill that mandate. On this issue, the mandate is clear. Mr. Trudeau made the promise. So that's what the committee essentially came up with, is saying, here you go. Here's one way to do it. If you want to come up with another way, well, then talk to us. And that's where the challenge, I think, has been.
Yeah, and just to add a bit to that, if I can, one of the things that worries me now, Nathan, and we haven't had much chance to talk about this, but as nobody reads our report, I worry about, no, we all know, and I certainly argued when Justin Trudeau was Justin Trudeau MP from Papineau and not even Liberal leader yet, we used to sit near each other in the house and we used to argue about PR. And as everyone would know, I've been a strong advocate for PR. And he didn't like first past the post, but he really liked preferential ballot. And I'd always try to convince him it was a very poor idea. In fairness to Justin Trudeau, when Craig Scott, who I hope is on this call, is a former NDP PR critic and brilliant law prof, and Craig put forward that motion in the 41st Parliament in favor of mixed member proportional. So in fairness to Justin, when he was Liberal leader, he let the caucus have a free vote, which revealed that the third party, as it then was, the Liberals were pretty much split right down the middle. There are strong supporters for proportional representation within that caucus to this day, but one of them isn't Justin Trudeau. So I worry, since our strong report on how completely inappropriate ranked ballots would be, that's not getting reported. The main reporting is around the fact that we call for a referendum, and that even the recommendation around proportionality is being lost in a cloud of, distorted interpretation of what Gallagher Index means. So I'll stop there. I know we've got lots of questions, and I certainly want to get to talking to people besides Nathan, but it is nice to see you, Nathan.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And again, there are people that are continually joining us on the call. We want to welcome them, and thank you again to both of you for being here with us today. So you've both alluded to this, but I think that a lot of the interest in today's meeting is really about finding the clues into where a roadmap for the government to move forward might be, either contained in your report or recommendations that you would be willing to make subsequently. How do we go from here to having a PR system in time for 2019 is the question that Canadians are asking right now. Why don't we go to Nathan first this time and then to Elizabeth?
Oh, I think the pathway is open to us. A lot of it depends on the government's political will. As Elizabeth has said, the report and all of the evidence said that perhaps Mr. Trudeau's preferred system of ranking the ballots but keep the same constituencies would even distort more the will of voters. And so it was pushed off the table. And as one Liberal said, we get it. Alternative vote is dead. Now moving on, it's about bringing in a bill in the spring. Have that bill pass through the House. If the Liberals want to bring something in that happens over time so that we bring in a little bit of proportionality in 2019, a bit more in the following election, that's also an option that both Elizabeth and I have promoted and others. The idea that we can change some of the seats right now without changing the riding boundaries. It's an interesting proposal that Fair Vote and Mr. Kingsley put forward, because Elections Canada has said there's a big barrier, or not a barrier, but it takes time. If you want to redraw the districts in Canada, it'd take 20 to 24 months for that process alone. So that's something we've been very concerned with. But I guess the point is that we want to look at any barrier the government puts up and then address that obstacle. Yet the challenge to this point has been that every time we answer one of those, remove the obstacle out of the way, the government comes up with another obstacle. So I agree with Elizabeth. We can't allow the committee's work to go to the side because it costs a lot of money, and it's the most comprehensive one in history, and it came with a really good conclusion that we can get proportionality in Canada, that we can make a made-in-Canada model, and that we can make every vote count so that voters don't feel like it's a wasted effort going to the polling station. That can be done by 2019. Move legislation in the spring. Another committee would be struck, hopefully similar to the design that we just had. We make modifications, we pass it through Parliament, make some adjustments to ridings if necessary. If not, then Elections Canada will begin its work. And they've told us as soon as they get a sense of where the direction's going, Elections Canada will begin the education program for Canadians, which will take at least a year to get people familiar with the new way of voting, which I think we can offer a pretty straightforward version of a ballot, pretty straightforward version of what their vote means. And then we conduct 2019. So I'm still hopeful, but it seems to be much less about the evidence, because we have a lot of that right now, and much more about the politics, convincing Liberal MPs that when the motion comes forward, when we're deliberating on this bill, that they are doing what they promised Canadians they would do, which is bring in a more fair and equal voting system where every vote across the country counts.
Go
I
ahead,
guess
Elizabeth.
okay, thanks. I'll dive in. I'm going to take it. I agree with everything Nathan said. I'm going to take it in the immediate short term, what all of you online can do. And this is a bit of a confused or perhaps potentially confusing message. I think everybody needs to go to mydemocracy.ca and fill out the survey. Primarily because how can that survey be used against us who want PR to say Canadians aren't interested in this topic? We spent X million dollars. We wrote to every household in Canada, and we only heard from X number of people. So I think it's important to actually go do the survey, or as Scott Reed called it, the Hogwarts sorting hat. Figure out if you're an innovator, a Guardian, or Gryffindor, or Hufflepuff. Figure it out. Do that, and then you can either send right in physically that postcard back again. One of my friends in the Green Party calls it hashtag Operation Postcard. So you can do that, send it back in with your own note, I want PR. Or email or write a letter to Mariam Monsef, the Minister of Democratic Institutions, and Justin Trudeau. So they feel some backlash, they feel some heat. We have a problem here that the interest of the mainstream media is not in getting rid of first past the post. If there's any interest in the large mainstream corporate media, it's in having a referendum to make sure we don't get rid of first past the post. So how do we create the public momentum so that I think a lot will depend on the Liberal cabinet doing this, testing the wind, say, oh, okay, we can get away with not keeping our promise. No one thinks it was a good promise, or we can never get away with not keeping that promise. People really care about that promise, and not just the usual suspects that we know are members of Lead Now or Fair Vote, or or Green Party, NDP supporters long term. These are lots of people we didn't expect. So December 31st is the deadline on the mydemocracy.ca, which I think, as strange as it is, and we could get into deep detail on why it's strange, but I think we need to use that at least to say Canadians are interested, and take that next step to send them, you didn't give me a chance to say at mydemocracy.ca that I want proportional representation, and I don't really care what kind it is as long as it's highly proportional, and whatever else you want to say. Past December 31st, I think we need a lot more. I mean, I always am saying this, some broken record, letters to the editor of the mainstream press. That's the one way we get to educate past the corporate control, is when voters and citizens write and say, I don't want to take a chance ever again. When people talk about radical and extreme parties as if they're always the small parties, look south of the border. Radical and extreme does not have to come from a small party. Look what Stephen Harper did in 10 years to Canada without ever having majority public support, only because of first past the post. We need to recognize that this is a once in a generation chance to hold the Liberals to that promise of bringing in a PR system. And I think it takes a lot more public mobilization than we've yet been able to do, although we are making, I think, a lot of progress in public awareness of this issue.
This actually gets us into one of our main questions right now, coming from the audience, which is how do we inform and educate and engage Canadians in this confusing moment where awareness does appear to be increasing? The polling over the summer showed very little awareness of the process. It more than doubled by October. We don't know how far it's going to go north in the coming weeks. But Nathan, do you have any more comments around the question of how to engage, how to mobilize, how to activate Canadians at this time?
Well, I don't think it was the government's intention, but through the reaction, as Elizabeth talked about, from the minister to the committee's work, through the launching of the mydemocracy.ca, which went very badly, I would almost say that more attention has been brought to electoral reform in the last 30 days unintentionally by the government than probably in the last 30 years. So Canadians are open to engaging. What is this postcard that I got? What's going on in the House of Commons that everybody's yelling about this special committee? The next step, though, is once you have their attention, bringing them to places like Fair Vote Canada, to Lead Now's work, to the Broadband Institute's work, and saying, here's what it means, and it almost getting over the idea that change is possible, because a lot of people just simply accept the voting system for the way it is, not knowing that there is something better. Elizabeth mentioned writing to mainstream media, small town papers. Where I live in northern BC, it can be a huge influence on the way people are thinking about things. And then, I mentioned earlier, the action of people in small groups or larger groups approaching individual MPs, hopefully they don't call the police on you, and their offices and say, hey, look, here's your platform. Here's the exact words that you asked for when you asked for our vote. Now we're asking for it back. That can be done in very small ways, small petitions. We have things on our website that allow people to craft up and show what is always required in politics, that there is a constituency out there beyond what some people say the usual suspects. Any of those normal activities are very important, and many of the groups engaging, like Broadbent and others, have the tools available for people to just simply borrow into their communities and activate and say, look, let's be hopeful about this, and let's get a voting system where I know my vote is going to matter and be reflected in Parliament.
So definitely increasing the volume matters on existing channels. One of our questioners from Simon wants to know, is there an easily digestible, high-level summary of what was in the committee's report, and would that be linked then to the larger committee? Does that exist online? There doesn't seem to be much of an effort to get that out into the public realm.
So there is a summary. Yeah, we have a summary, and we have the report's large. It's 300 pages. It takes you through the whole history of voting in Canada, all sorts of different options of voting systems. So you can go as deep as you want from what the committee, and we were blessed, as Elizabeth said. There's also a summary, and I'll put it on my Facebook. We'll put it on the screen today, where it just walks through the basic recommendations. Right, here are the key recommendations and why we recommended them. That's a very 50,000-foot summary of what's going on. I think that would be helpful.
So getting more, like, just to going back to the point. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say we've got materials. Well, obviously, I think Fair Vote Canada, Green Party, NDP, the websites of the groups that have been working on this. I know we've done a shortened version of ERRE, what our conclusions were. But the report, I hope the report is quite digestible. It's got, obviously it's long, but it's really well organized and very well written, for which we can't take credit. I mean, we worked on it as a committee word by word, but the parliamentary analysts, we were very lucky that the two parliamentary analysts from the Library of Parliament were brilliant and hardworking, and gosh, I'm very proud of the report, which is one of those, and I think everyone on the committee, ironically, I think when I talked to the Liberal members of the committee who didn't go along with every word, but they went along with 90% of it, we're all proud of the work we did, and we would like people to read it. So a digestible summary, I think there are some online. I was trying to find them quickly, but I'll make sure to put something at a higher point on our website so people can find it.
Well, certainly we can include that kind of a link in our follow-up to, and then the archive video of this webinar. There are quite a few questions about timeline. Quite a few questions wanting to know, is there actually enough time to put PR into place before the 2019 election? Does Elections Canada have the capacity? And a sort of a related question, people want to know, has Prime Minister Trudeau committed to allowing a free vote of parliamentarians on the issue?
I don't know about the last one, Elizabeth. I'm not sure if a free vote has been suggested yet.
I haven't heard a commitment to that yet. And is there time? Yes, I think Nathan and I both believe there is time. There isn't time. I don't think it would be reasonable to suggest that we would have. Let's just work through timelines really quickly. 2019 election in the fall. Now, one thing, by the way, is the fair elections, the fixed timelines for elections have been changed in the past. I've seen a lot of people on social media suggesting give yourselves an extra year and have the election in 2020. But I don't think we need to do that, but it is legally possible. But fall 2019, let's hold that as the fixed election date. Elections Canada has said they need 2 years for a complicated change, right? If it's an easy change, they don't really need the 2 years, but to be on the safe side, 2 years, so it means legislation in place by fall 2017, legislation introduced by spring 2017. And as Mark Mayran told our committee, when the legislation is introduced for first reading in spring 2017, Elections Canada can begin preparing. Now, it's unreasonable to imagine we could have a referendum by fall 2017 because our current Referendum Act does not allow for a referendum on the subject of electoral reform. You'd have to pass major amendments to the Referendum Act, and you'd have to create very strict, I believe you'd have to have very strict regulations around donations and campaign spending in a referendum. You'd also have to have, I think, increased funding to Elections Canada on education. I don't see a referendum before fall 2017, but I do think the time between fall 2017 and fall 2019 creates opportunities for additional forms of tests for legitimacy. I know the NDP early on, and had advocated for a citizens' assembly as a way of doing that. But the technical question, is there time? Absolutely. There's time to change the voting system by 2019, and there's even time to have a referendum first. Although, and this is always hard for me, because to be part of the consensus within the committee, I went along with the idea that yes, the referendum should be before 2019, but the bulk of the evidence was for electoral reform to PR. The decision around a referendum is really a political question, and they could do it, as Nathan was suggesting earlier, as a confirmatory vote after Canadians have had a couple of elections experiencing a referendum. I mean, experiencing voting under proportional representation.
Yep, totally agree with everything Elizabeth just said. The timelines are available. A little bit depends on how complex or how proportional you want to make the system. Again, that's why we were giving offers of sort of doing this in stages over the course of 1 or 2 or 3 elections. That would allow for just minor incremental changes, but that we would crack that ceiling at least of saying we're going to go from unfair voting where we get false majorities, and we're going to move increasingly in stages to where we get to a much more fair voting system, and Canadians would know that and get that experience as they go. So again, we're trying to work with the timelines we now have available. The government took 8 months to even get this process started in the first place, and we said at the time, boy, we're going to need this time later on, let's not waste it, but we're here now. It is available to us, but it's going to take some real determination, and I guess we leave this last session with the Minister's performance and the Prime Minister's sort of lackluster enthusiasm. They've changed in the last 8 months from when the Minister first came to our committee, was confirming many of the things that we're saying here today. The first past the post is antiquated, it doesn't meet the needs of a modern Canada, and it's time for change. Flash forward 6, 7 months, suddenly you look at the survey and the bias within that saying, would you like to change the voting system even if chaos were to ensue? It was a little too transparent in terms of the government looking to find a back door out of this promise. We need to help them find the front door again.
There are lots of questions about why you didn't recommend a specific system. You enumerated at the beginning, Elizabeth, some of the options that are really made available by your recommendations, but why didn't you land on a particular system? The viewers want to know. And also, does any of that, just sorry, as a follow-up so we can get a few more in, does any of that have to do with any particular partisan interest by the Greens specifically or the New Democrats specifically? Do you each have, for example, different preferred systems? Is that an agenda at play here?
Okay, I think the quick answer, and I also have to say there's a limitation in what Nathan and I can tell you about why we did what we did in different ways within the committee, because the negotiations between all of us as individual MPs in the in-camera sessions remain a private matter, and I can't reveal who said what or what party wanted what. I can tell you that I think it would be fair to say that time limitations, consensus takes time. And we had a firm deadline of December 1st, and I wish we'd been able to do what I kept suggesting, and I think they thought I was kidding. Let's go away someplace. Let's get out of Ottawa and be in a wilderness lodge, and we're not allowed out till we come to consensus. I think people thought I was kidding, but I think that's the only way. So we needed, I think, with more time, who knows? As for different systems, that was never an issue. As a matter of fact, the Green Party's never had a specific commitment to a particular system until our special general meeting in Calgary, December 3rd, 4th, where we decided after the ERRE report was tabled that it would be to the benefit of public education to be able to explain one system. So while I personally liked a lot of them and could have gone with any of them, we decided that in order to be in concert with the NDP having taken a position for mixed member proportional and having had the PEI plebiscite just voted in the Prince Edward Island public, although the Premier now wants to say it wasn't a high enough voter turnout to bind the Liberal government PEI, PEI picked mixed member proportional. So the Greens now support as our preferred system mixed member proportional so that we can continue to work together in explaining to Canadians this is a system we can move to. It meets the requirements of Westminster parliamentary democracy. New Zealand's already done it, and it had exactly the same system of parliament as we did. So that's my short answer.
Yeah, so
What
the
about you,
committee,
Nathan? Go ahead.
yeah,
Go ahead.
the committee wasn't mandated to come up with a specific system. The committee was mandated to come up with options for the government, which makes sense because we weren't there's different types of committees. One of them, you get a bill, you're a legislative committee, and you are looking at a specific law, and you're changing the law or accepting it as it is. So as we saw the hesitation growing from the Liberals in particular, we said, well, your first major question on this adventure is to choose to go to proportionality. Once you've cleared that hurdle and you understand the importance of that, you then have to do all the trade-off questions, because every system has trade-offs. As is often said, there's nothing perfect, but there are some that are much better than others. The official party position for the NDP is a mixed member system, yet I've said from the beginning we were not going to sacrifice the good looking for the perfect. We understood that every group coming to this conversation was going to have different interests. We wanted to respect that and say, you want to move with that fair vote Kingsley model where there's a bit of a hybrid going on. If you want to move to a mixed member system which you drop on an extra number of seats, then that could be something that we would look at from a regional basis. But essentially, we wanted to ensure that that first question about proportionality was answered. And then let's move ahead. It was actually an attempt, and it was misunderstood, I think, maybe by the government, to give them more options, to be more consensus-oriented with them, to say, we understand you have different interests at play, but so let's work with that and pick one of the options on the table that the committee gave you. Instead, the ministers chose to interpret it as failure, or we didn't make the hard choices, and it's like, well, you should have put that in our mandate, which you didn't. And why would you see as an offer to work together as somehow a failure? It was a confusing and an unfortunate way to respond. Yet here we are now. And my last conversation with the minister said, if you want to back up the words about working with the opposition and working on the best interest of Canadians, then pick up the pen, sit down with some paper, and let's start drafting legislation together, which always works out better in the end, rather than what they did with, say, the My Democracy online survey, which they went off and did on their own. And the reception has been terrible because it had no input other than from people the Liberals went and hand chose, and it looks like what it is. So that's where we're at right now. We've given them a few options, all the pros and cons of each of the voting systems. Myself, anything that gets the proportionality is good. Then we get to specifics after that.
And that's really a key part of this, isn't it? That they haven't actually answered the question about whether they believe in the principle of proportionality yet, have they?
We've asked the question many times, right? That specific, do you believe that proportional, that making each vote count means making a proportional system? That's the logic that most people who understand this topic. If you believe that every vote, wherever it's cast in the country for whoever it's cast for, must matter, then the only way to do that is through proportional systems. But we can't pin the government yet down on that. I don't know if Elizabeth's ever heard them say it, but I haven't.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, it's hard to say who the they are. If you look, there were 5 Liberals on our committee, and the chair didn't play a role in the negotiations or discussions. Francis Scarpelleggi, I think we'd all say did a great job and stayed pretty nonpartisan. I think the 4 Liberals on the committee, and I've said it publicly, so I don't see a problem saying it in a webinar, I don't think this was being driven out of some top-down thing. I just think those 4 individuals did what they did. I'm not going to go into it more than that. Then the question of they, who's the they? Well, as far as I'm concerned, the government of Canada, in a speech from the throne, said, in order to make sure every vote counts, 2015 is the last election under first past the post. I don't know any other way to interpret that other than proportionality. Then you look at the 5 principles under which the committee was told to operate, and one of the principles was to ensure that there was a greater reflection of how Canadians voted and the way their parliament was formed. Well, what is that other than proportionality? There were other concerns, I mean, simplicity of the ballot, better representation of underrepresented groups, but better representation of underrepresented groups, higher voter turnout, those are fringe benefits that are big, right? I'm not going to minimize them. But the main reason for getting rid of first past the post is the perversity of allowing a party and a leader that does not have the support of the majority of Canadians having 100% of the power. So, I mean, I will commend Justin Trudeau for reducing the personal power he has as Prime Minister, for having true cabinet government, for having reduced that kind of top-down one-man rule. But that potential is still within our system. A Prime Minister in Canada can have extraordinary personal power to control everything except the courts. And even there, Stephen Harper tried to chip away at that. We can't run the risk ever again of having an election where a radical and extreme party with the minority of public support gets 100% of the power. And that's what that's what I really don't know that they quite understand. That's the worrying part of Justin Trudeau's comments to Le Devoir. People were more concerned about first past the post when Harper was Prime Minister, but now that I'm Prime Minister, people are less concerned. Yeah, unless you have the capacity to look forward 4 years or 8 years and look south of the border and think, okay, we thought Stephen Harper was a pretty extreme character. OMG. Donald Trump is president-elect. We have to inoculate our voting system against extremism in populist demagoguery form, and don't think it can't happen in Canada. This is our chance to make sure our voting system ensures that if someone's going to be a majority prime minister, even if at least they must have majority public support.
Now I'll go to you, Nathan, on this one as a follow-up. The idea that the ultimate result, the makeup of Parliament, should be an expression of the political will, that notion has been somewhat muddied by continual references to the possibility that ranked ballots or alternative voting could be a solution, and that in fact we're not having a conversation in the country about whether you want a majoritarian winner-takes-all system or a proportional system. And people are asking, what's so wrong with ranked ballots? What's so wrong with AV as a result?
Right. So at certain levels of government, or when a party is picking their leader, ranking the preferences on the ballot can work. The problem in a multi-party system is when you do a ranked ballot, what ends up happening is, first of all, not every vote counts, so that breaks that first promise. But it also ends up distorting what Canadians wanted and the results they get out the other end, the so-called Gallagher Index, even more than the current system we have. So the first principle we should take is to do no harm, right? Not make the problems we're trying to fix worse by going to something like alternative vote. In terms of the outcome, a lot of the myth busting that has to go on, as I think Elizabeth has started to already in this, is to suggest that when you look around the world, countries that use a more proportional system are more stable. They have better policy outcomes in terms of the environment, in terms of the economy, in terms of social programs. And people will say it's chicken and egg. It's those countries are just great countries and they get great policy. And it's like, well, yes, but they also use voting systems in which cooperation is encouraged, where the venomous winner-takes-all politics is discouraged because there's no sense in trying to rip your opponent apart. You may be working with them the day after. And that, again, the empowerment is brought closer back to the citizen. When they walk into the ballot box, they know for certainty that if they cast a ballot, the ballot's going to have some influence on the outcome, on who governs. So those two principles, it reduces the cynicism because people know that there's not some sort of weird electoral college like in the States or our own first past the post mix-ups where 39% suddenly equals 100%. That's bad math. So to the person's question, I think we can do a lot better, and I think all of the outcomes, Professor Liepard and others have suggested that you get much better policy, you get much more fair and consensual government, and you don't get these radical policy switches. For such a stable, polite country like Canada, we actually have a radical voting system in that when a government comes in, it spends half of its time wiping out the policies of the last government, which is fine if you're happy with the new guys, but you're really upsetting if you're the old guys. And then the old guys come in and they wipe it back out, and you just go back and forth. And in terms of the long-term projects, climate change, poverty, dealing with some of the more profound issues on First Nations, you actually need a much more steady course than the one. And I think it's one of the reasons we've been failing on things like the environment and climate change, First Nations, and poverty in Canada, despite voters saying in almost every election we want to do something about those types of issues.
Great. We have 10 minutes left, and so I'm going to read 3 questions to you from our viewers, and maybe you can address whichever question you want. You can both jump in, but there's lots of interest, and I want to make sure that we don't miss anyone's question. The first one here is the committee now finished, and is it unable now to meet anymore? Number two, Minister Monsef has said there is draft legislation due to be introduced in the spring. What could it possibly contain? And number three, if we do go for a PR system, if the government does agree with the principle of proportionality, who ultimately would decide which form of PR we would have? So why don't we do a lightning round on those and see if we can take a few more before we're done. Either one of you. Whoever's not muted.
Very quickly, the committee is done. We no longer exist as a committee, so we can't meet again. We have no existence in Parliament or in law. And who decides? Well, the Cabinet can decide, Parliament can decide, or the voters can decide through a referendum. All of those are options. In the reality of a majority Parliament, the Prime Minister and Cabinet can decide. And when the legislation comes forward, what can it contain? It could contain a recommendation against the ERRE report consensus. It could say we want to move to ranked ballots, and Canadians will try this for a while and see it as an incremental step towards proportionality, which of course it isn't. But given the lack of public understanding of what our report said, I think that's a political risk.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that one of the last things the committee did was pass a motion out of the committee suggesting that any legislation that comes forward, the committee should be reformed, because the principle of having all the parties at the table, the principle of making sure that every Canadian is heard from, at least through the parliamentary process, is there. Yeah, what's in the bill? I don't know. I would be surprised if Mr. Trudeau takes the risk of trying to push through his own preferred system, despite there not being any evidence for it. But he might. He may believe what he said in Le Devoir, that people are kind of happy with him right now, so they don't want to throw out the system entirely, and that they'll forgive him if he comes in with a system as long as he smiles while he's doing it. It would be a very, very big political risk, because it has been generally slammed as a voting system that would overwhelmingly favor Liberals, and would be a pretty cynical approach to for a Prime Minister who's promised to be anything but cynical.
We've talked a lot about the Liberal position. There's some questions about where the Conservatives stand. Do you think that there's any support within the Conservative Party for proportionality? And secondly, if there was a referendum question, which we've identified as a challenge and complicated and not a preferable option, do you think the Conservative Party would accept a question which simply asks, do you want a proportional system, yes or no? Is that even in the cards?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay, well, quickly then, I'd say yes, there's a lot of support for proportional representation within the Conservative Party. People like Scott Reid, who was on our committee, have long written that the first past the post system is perverse. But the Conservative Party official position is that they have no position on what voting system Canada should use. I think that, but as Nathan said earlier, they were resolute that we had to have a referendum before any change happened to the voting system. And they did not accept that question as the questioner suggested, which I think is fair. Do you want PR, yes or no? They want on the ballot, do you want PR, or do you want to keep going first past the post? So the status quo would be on the ballot. So their position is more about a referendum and less about how we vote.
The only thing I would add is that if you history matters, and great Conservative stalwarts like Jason Kenney and Scott Reid and Tom Flanagan and Stephen Harper have all previously advocated for a change in the voting system, because they understood, particularly I guess some of those coming from the West, that there was often this feeling of alienation and distortion of the will of Canadians. And so they've all advocated for it in the past. They didn't when they were in government, obviously, because the system worked for them. And that's often the challenge of getting an electoral change happening, is that you need a party that just went through an election in which the old system worked for them, willing to actually change it despite it having been successful. So we think we have that moment, although Mr. Trudeau has certainly put some doubt into people as to whether he'll follow through on it.
Well, you make a good point about
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just thinking, I forgot to mention that Rona Ambrose, after our committee report came in, said her advice to Trudeau was, quote unquote, park it, like the issue of electoral reform. Now that we have a committee report where the Conservatives were in the majority of the report recommendations, I think that reveals a lot about the Conservatives' interest in electoral reform is actually, no, just park it. So, but getting to a successful majority report of our committee, I think that was something that a lot of people didn't think this committee would be able to do, and we did deliver the first ever recommendation for proportional representation voting from a parliamentary committee.
But certainly outside of the current House of Commons, there's a long tradition, as Nathan said, of some outlier maybe as supporters of PR in the Conservative Party. Certainly the Every Voter Counts Alliance, of which Broadband Institute, Canada Lead Now, et cetera, are part of, launched with Guy Giorno, former Premier Mike Harris and former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Chief of Staff, because around the question of the fact that PR takes power away from electoral elites and gives it back to the people. That's a pretty compelling argument. In terms of before we go, we have lots of questions about how to advance this issue. What do you think are the most compelling arguments we need to be making now? Because there's so many in favor of PR that have been mentioned already on this call. Possibly like increased voter turnout, more representation of underrepresented groups. Aside from this question of the expression of the political will, is that where we need to be pushing right now, especially where there's so much conversation about across the world about the power of elites and the public feeling disenfranchised and not heard on really, really big important questions? Any parting advice on where we find the most compelling arguments to move PR forward?
I still think it's explaining to people what our current voting system is. We heard from the Forum Research Group that in their polling, only 40% of Canadians could actually say that the current voting system is first past the post. Of those 40%, how many actually really understand how the system works? It's really keeping it simple. But we don't get a momentum towards fair voting until people understand that our current system is really unfair. And that's where we start.
I think it's helping people certainly understand where the issue is, and everyone can reach one, each one can teach one. It's as much the idea of remaining skeptical, and I think there's a healthy amount of material to be skeptical as to whether the government's going to keep this promise, yet not becoming cynical. That if we fall into the cynical trap of saying, oh, it's just politicians being politicians, of course Trudeau promised and said anything to get elected, but as per usual, someone's breaking those promises once they're in. That is incredibly unhelpful, because where does that lead us, right? It just makes every promise in the future. And this is about integrity for me. It's as much about democratic reform and having a fair voting system. But for the Prime Minister, when I look across the aisle at him and I say, look, you came out of 10 years of a lot of skepticism and cynicism towards the government. I think a very destructive government under Mr. Harper. You were supposed to be different, so please be different. Don't become cynical. Just hold on to the things that you valued before you got into the top job. And so for Canadians, I'd say stay tuned as well. Look to those lead groups, Broadband, Lead Now, Fair Vote. They'll be running, I hope, campaigns going into the time when we actually see legislation. And the demand that I'm going to be making of the government, and I hope Elizabeth joins me on this, is that bring us into the drafting process, bring us into the actual building of a new law. That's how real consensus works. That's what real consultation looks like. Not some process where you pretend to listen, but really you've already made up your minds. We've seen that on pipelines and everything else. We want to see something that is actually sincere. And the way to make it sincere is to bring the opposition in and innovate, do things differently. I was an innovator on that little test, and I want to see innovation when it comes to, I didn't make Gryffindor. I was really hoping I'd get into Gryffindor this time, but I think to be hopeful.
Gryffindor innovator is the same.
Oh, it is? Oh, good. I didn't realize. But mostly stay engaged. Don't lose faith. Don't lose hope in this thing, because that's what the skeptics and the cynics really want you to do, is to say it's all for naught, and support those great groups doing the on-the-ground stuff. Letters matter, petitions matter. Get out there and be active with this, and we'll help be a loud megaphone for all of that.
Well, thank you very much to both of you for bringing us up to date. We certainly feel that the call for proportional representation in this country has the kind of momentum it never has before. The PEI referendum and the incredible work that you did on this committee, we congratulate you, and we thank you for giving us some clues today about how the government could move forward realistically to bring in a change by 2019. And also we want to thank everyone else who joined us today, hundreds and hundreds of people interested in this topic right before the holidays. That's fantastic. please heed the advice of Elizabeth May and Nathan Cullen to turn up the volume. We're going to be emailing you an archive of this webinar, and we hope that you're going to be sharing it on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other channels available so that we can make sure to maintain the pressure as 2016 ends, and hopefully we'll have some good changes in 2017. On behalf of the Broadband Institute, I want to thank all of our audience participants and most of all to our presenters for taking out the time. You've had a very busy year, and Canada thanks you.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thanks, Elizabeth. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to Broadband Institute for putting this together. Merry Christmas, Nathan. Miss you. Take care.